Welcome to your Music Theory E-lesson on sonata form. In this lesson, we're going to be learning how sonata form works and how to recognize the various parts of a sonata form piece. Following along and understanding what is happening in each part will help you appreciate and enjoy the music more. And if you're a performer playing a sonata form piece, help you find good ways of shaping your performance to make the most of it and make your listeners really appreciate it. From the late 18th century all the way through the 19th century, the sonata form was the most important and prestigious formal structure in classical music. All the great composers you can think of, and many more besides, used the sonata form for many of their biggest and most important works. Though we use the name sonata form, in reality, composers use sonata form for everything from symphonies to quartets to overtures to serenades to concerti and many other pieces. So what's so special about this form? Why did all these composers like it so much? For one, sonata form is rich and complex, with a powerful narrative and a dramatic shape too. But what's especially cool about sonata form is that it also has lots and lots of room for flexibility and creativity built into it. It doesn't have a set length or a number of ideas. Composers get to shape each sonata form piece they write to their own unique vision. This creative flexibility and variability is what makes sonata form so cool. Unfortunately, when you're first learning about this form, it can also make it hard to keep track of what's going on in the music. We have to learn to experience and understand each individual piece through the lens of a basic sonata form structure, even though this structure never gets used exactly the same way twice. What this basic structure looks like is this. There are three main parts: the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. However, the recapitulation is a modified repetition of the exposition, so overall we can describe the form as an A-B-A prime, like this. Composers often, but don't always, include a short introduction and a short coda at the beginning and the end. Traditionally, the exposition repeats once before moving on to the development, but be careful when you're listening because some performers like to skip this repetition. The basic idea of sonata form, what gives it its dramatic narrative structure, can be seen in its harmonic structure and thematic structure. In the exposition, there are two main tonal areas: tonal area 1, which I've colored blue, and tonal area 2, which I've colored red. The first tonal area will be the tonic key, while the second tonal area can really be anything, which is what the X represents here. Each tonal area will typically have its own principal melodic idea or theme, which we usually just call theme 1 and theme 2. These themes will also typically contrast in their texture and style. In the narrative of sonata form, the contrast or conflict between these two keys and their respective themes is what creates a grand structural dissonance which needs to be resolved. How this happens is that the recapitulation will recap these same two themes, but this time the second tonal area is changed to be the tonic key, thus resolving the structural dissonance of the exposition. This is the basic sonata form idea. If you see a piece with two thematic ideas first presented in different keys, and then later on presented in the same key, that's the best clue there is that you're listening to a sonata form piece. In order to make this narrative really interesting and dramatic, the in-between development section is the place where composers build up and intensify the structural dissonance by passing quickly through multiple keys, as represented by X, Y, and Z here, fragmenting and elaborating and developing the thematic material from the exposition. You should now get the basic structure of the entire sonata form. However, in order to fully understand what's going on and follow along with real sonata form pieces, we're going to need to look in a little bit more detail at each section. Theme 1 and Theme 2 with their respective keys are the important pillars of the exposition. There are a few important things we should know about Theme 1 and Theme 2 and their keys. First of all, even though the new key can be anything but the tonic again, it's usually 5 if the original key is major, and 3 if the original key is minor. Second, you should be aware that Theme 1 and Theme 2 can actually have more than one melodic idea. For this reason, it's better to think of Theme 1 and Theme 2 as theme groups. There is always one main theme in each theme group that is the most recognizable and important, but in long pieces like symphonies, composers will often have quite a bit of different melodic ideas in each theme group. As I mentioned earlier, theme groups 1 and 2, and especially their main themes, will usually contrast a lot. Theme group 1 tends to be more rhythmic, motivic, and have a thick, dramatic texture. Theme group 2 tends to be more lyrical and pretty. There are two other important parts to the exposition. First of all, to get between the two theme areas, there is a section called the transition. The main purpose of the transition is to modulate to the new key. The transition is melodically and thematically very flexible. This sometimes makes it hard to recognize the boundary between theme group 1 and the transition. The important thing to listen for is the modulation. No matter how many ideas are in theme group 1, they probably won't get very far from the tonic key. Luckily, hearing the end of the transition is usually easy because very often the transition will end by stopping dramatically on a half cadence in the key of the second theme. This pause, known as the medial caesura, is an easy way to recognize when theme 2 begins. After theme group 2, composers will often add a few melodic ideas to clarify and reinforce the new key. We call this kind of material closing material or a closing theme. The closing material will end with an obvious and clear cadence in the new key, represented here by another little fermata. Listen for this obvious cadence because it marks the end of the exposition. Sometimes composers need a little bit of wiggle room to transition back to the beginning or into the development. We call this kind of stuff a codetta. Okay, at this point you now know almost everything you need to know about how sonata form works. There's just a few things we need to know about the other two sections, the recap and the development. First of all, as I already showed you earlier, the recapitulation is always very similar to the exposition. The only real difference is that the transition section has to be altered in order to arrive in the tonic key instead of heading to the new key at the medial caesura. After the second recap medial caesura, you'll hear theme group 2 and the closing material again, but now in the tonic key. And when you hear the cadence at the end of the closing material, that's when you know the piece proper is over. Anything you hear after that is what we call a coda, which is usually just a little bit of material at the end to close the piece off. The last stuff we need to learn is just about the development. The development section is the freest and most flexible part of the form, where composers show off their creative and dramatic chops, mixing, fragmenting, and elaborating their themes while they travel through many key areas. Luckily, since there is no set form to the development, there is not a bunch of terminology for you to learn. The only special term you need to know for the development is what we call the retransition. This is the last part of the development, which leads back to the original key for the recap. The retransition is often a dramatic prolongation of 5, which launches us back into the opening theme and the opening key. Alright, let's review what we've learned. Here are the basic terms you need to know to understand sonata form. The three main parts are the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. In addition, there might be an introduction before the exposition and a little bit of coda after the recapitulation. The exposition has four main parts: the theme 1 or theme group 1, the transition, which has the medial caesura at the end of it, theme 2 or theme group 2, and then closing material. And finally, anything at the very end of the exposition, we call that little codetta, after the final closing cadence. The development is totally free, doesn't have any set form, except for it typically has a retransition at the end, which leads back to the original key. The recapitulation has all the same parts as the exposition, except for they're now all heard in the tonic key. Now let's apply. Let's start by looking at a very, very simple example of a sonata form, the first movement of Beethoven's 19th Piano Sonata. Here is the exposition. There's no introduction here. It starts right off with theme 1 in the tonic key of G minor. Since this is such a short, simple piece, it's not really a theme group. There's just this one thematic idea. Next, Beethoven starts again with what sounds like theme 1 again. But towards the end of the phrase, he changes things to effect a modulation to a new key, ending with a half cadence in B flat major, which is 3 of the original tonic key. This half cadence is the medial caesura. With this modulation and caesura, we must realize that what we're hearing is in fact the transition section. Moving on, we hear theme group 2, which again is just one theme in this very short sonata. Notice how theme 2 is a bit more lyrical and less dramatic than theme 1, with a new pretty texture based on an Alberti bass figuration. In the last system of this page, we get some simple new closing material which reinforces the new key of B flat and comes to an obvious cadence. This final cadence marks the end of the exposition. and in this case there's no codetta. We just repeat straight back to the beginning. Let's listen to where we left off at theme 2. Moving on, we get a very simple development section. It only modulates to one new key, E flat, and is mostly made up of freely new material, but with a hint of the closing material from the exposition in the third system. This leads into the retransition, back in G minor, the tonic key, but focused around a long pedal tone on 5 of G minor, a D7 chord. This retransition builds the tension and pushes us into the recap. The recap works just like the exposition did, beginning with the exact same opening theme 1. The only difference is that the transition section is changed so that after starting to move towards B flat again in the second system, it ends up back in G minor where we belong, resolving that structural clash between G minor and B flat that we heard in the exposition. The medial caesura now is on a D7 chord, 5 of G minor. After that, we hear theme 2 and the closing material again, but now in G minor. Finally, after the complete cadence, there's a little bit of coda material at the end to finish off the piece. That's all we have time for today. To continue practicing, consult the supplementary files that go along with this video. Sonata form pieces are some of the most interesting and beautiful pieces ever written. Have fun applying the lessons you learned today to your future music listening and performing.